Chris Eyre, and with me this week is Michael Kennedy. We usually like to cover a number of pieces of news, but this week the news seems to have been entirely full of one event, and that's the bombings and shootings in Paris a week ago as of a few hours' time. We've got several questions arising from that, but the first question that occurred to me was, why are we so anxious to talk about Paris when the day before there was an attack in Beirut killing over 40? There have been attacks by Boko Haram in Nigeria this week and earlier in the year, killing a lot more people. And it's only when the Paris attack happens that we see a lot of coverage in the media. Have you any thoughts on this, Michael?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things I would imagine at play. One is the fact that I would think across the world most people know Paris.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in that sense, people have some type of connection. Like it or not, it seems like the media is pretty focused on ratings and what's going to get people to tune in. And so I think in some sense, we've got to take that into account. Whereas Nigeria and even as you and I talked about the attack in Mali that happened today, don't get as much press coverage, primarily I would say because of the location and not as much interest internationally in those locations as there would be in Paris. So right, wrong, or not, I think that may contribute to that issue. You know, as Christians, though, I think the question would come in, do we believe that all life's sacred? If we do, then we should report, we should have information going out on all of these incidences at the same level of coverage. So I think that's definitely something that would be needed to be talked through and thought through. Mm-hmm. But again, if you're talking about secular media coverage, their primary focus, I think, is going to be on what's going to get people to tune in, mm-hmm. And that's the reason I think Paris was focused on as much as it was.
Mm-hmm. I was certainly thinking that I can understand why it would obsess us in the UK to some extent, because France is our next door country. An awful lot of people from England have been to France, and particularly to Paris. I've been there several times myself. I have friends living there, and obviously one of my first concerns was, were they anywhere near the Bataclan nightclub at the time? Happily, no. So there's a closer connection. But then, if you only love your friends, as Jesus says, how are you better than the tax collectors?
That's right. Yeah.
So I think that's something that we ought to at least try to overcome. Whether the media will try to overcome it, however, is a different matter. And yes, Paris is very well known, and there are no places in Nigeria which are particularly well known, apart from possibly their capital. Beirut. And one of the things that came to mind when talking about Beirut and also earlier in the year Kenya was that we perhaps expect heightened levels of violence in these places, so it's not so singular an event. And I don't think that is a justifiable excuse for saying, oh well, we can just forget about that either.
Yeah. Yeah, I would definitely think that as well. I think in a lot of people's minds, they would expect things to be going on in some of those locations just by um, the unstable nature of many of the governments there, and especially in locations in the Middle East, expect for there to be things like that going on. As it moves towards the West and more Western style democracies and things like that, I think people begin to look and take notice more so,
Mhm.
um, and, and pay attention to situations like that, because and this is not the right attitude, but I think it's at least for many Americans, it's the attitude that many of them take. Just keep it over there, and as long as it doesn't hit our soil, we're okay with that.
Mhm.
Which is, as a believer, as a Christian, not should not be our mindset, our approach. But I do think that's a lot of Americans' approach to the issue at hand.
Mhm. Okay. Moving on from that, um, I wrote a blog piece basically off the back of the French president's immediate reactions to the news of that, and he was basically declaring war and saying that there would be swift and extreme retaliation. And indeed, to some extent, there was, because within 24 hours, there was a large French raid on Islamic State's effective capital in Syria.
Mhm.
Um, my concern here is not only that I have grave reservations about the manner of of that in terms of bombing a city which has a risk of innocent casualties
Mhm.
always, but it was immediate. It wasn't thought through. It was an overreaction. And that goes on from there to, for instance, people talking about massively increased security measures in France and other European countries. Um, I think we are in my country the country with the biggest concentration of CCTV cameras in the world already. Um, our Prime Minister is increasing the size of our security service by 25%, at least in terms of budget. Um, there's talk also of closing borders within Europe. Now, I suppose for an American audience, Europe has a degree of being united, which is less than that of the United States. But
Right.
most of Europe has had entirely open borders. And
Mhm.
one of the founding principles is the free movement of goods, capital, and labour. And this looks as if it could end the principle of free movement of people. And an analogy I used was what would happen in the States if suddenly you had to go through immigration controls when you were commuting from New Jersey to New York
Mhm.
or something like that. What the published aim of Islamic State is, and Al Qaeda was before them, is to make us overreact in reprisals abroad, which they say gives them more recruits, and in persecution at home. What I value about Europe is the fact that it is relatively free. You do have free movement of people around the place. My worry is that we're basically destroying our own freedoms. We're certainly likely to destroy them for Muslims in our countries, and we are thereby doing the terrorists' job for them effectively. What's your feeling?
Yeah, I definitely think that the response from the French government was swift. You know, the thought that it wasn't well thought through, I would ask in that just a follow-up question of, I'm assuming, and take this as just an assumption, that for them to be able to bomb the way that they bombed and the targets that they bombed, that they had tremendous amount of intelligence on the front end, I would assume.
Mm-hmm.
If not, we've got another problem in it being indiscriminate in that sense. But I would imagine that their intelligence services, along with the rest of European countries and the United States, in that process, had identified those locations, had said, if we're going to hit, here's the places that we need to hit, and so I would think that it was probably thought through more, but the way it was portrayed in the media and to the French people and the world was almost a rash response. We've got to do something, so this is what we're going to do. And yet I think it was probably a lot more calculated than that when you really boil it down to what took place. My thoughts would be that that was a scenario that had been put forth already, had been vetted, had been talked through, and possibly just waiting for an opportunity. And something like that provides an opportunity to be able to do something they were planning to do anyway, possibly. But it gives fuel to the fire so that all the French people and all the people in the world say, go get them. So that would be my first initial thought on that. I would think it would have been well thought out on the front end of that. I could be wrong. But that would be my assumption in that sense. Certainly, I think that you do run into issues now, and you do in any scenario where a terrorist organization begins to do things regardless of which god they are naming in the process, that causes people to be fearful and to overreact in those situations. And so I think we're seeing that even now here in the States with I think last count was 27 governors had said we're not going to take any Syrian refugees into to our states. And so I think in that sense you're right that it causes people to overreact in that sense. But I do recognize too that I've used this analogy with people in the discussion. At least here, I know that most people lock their doors at night before they go to bed. Not sure if it happens that way in the UK or not, but here, most people lock their doors before going to bed. And so if someone came and knocked on their door, they would have the opportunity to vet that person, to decide whether or not to allow that person to come in or provide help or whatever in that situation. And so I do want to be cautious in that sense as well and say, I'm not sure that some of our countries are not thinking in the same mentality that most people think, that we need to be cautious to make sure that we know who's coming in and that kind of thing. But I do see that there's often a hyper reaction that pushes things beyond what a well thought out critical approach to the situation could be.
There's certainly been concern widely expressed in Europe about, of course, refugees from Syria.
Hmm.
And I am concerned that certainly some countries, happily so far not my own, have turned around and said, look, we don't want any Syrian refugees, kind of missing the fact that the people who carried out the attacks in Paris are the same people that the refugees are trying to get away from, for the most part. What is your feeling about the scad of American governors who are saying, not in my state now?
Yeah, well, I think again, I think most of that is political posturing.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have that authority.
Mm-hmm.
Once refugees come into the country, they have pretty much free reign to move to whatever state they want to. So you can say none in my state, but if they come in into New York, then they could migrate down to one of those states without much issue. So again, I think that is political posturing, more than it is anything else. But I think you do have to consider the reality that a group like the IS is going to use whatever means possible if they're going to try to carry out attacks in other locations, whatever means possible to get their people in there. Now, everything I've read has said that the last thing that someone in that situation would try to do is come as a refugee, just because of the process that it takes to be able to get in. You're looking at 18 months to 24 months to even be able to go through that process and be relocated in that sense. So I'm not sure that's the way most people would try to go about it if they were trying to get in a country and do terrorism there. I read, I think earlier today, a stat about refugees, at least in the United States, since 9/11, that we've settled, I believe it's 784,000 refugees since that period of time, and that out of those, 3 have been arrested on terrorism charges. So, you look at that and you think, this that we're experiencing in Syria with Syrian refugees is not a new problem. We had refugees coming in even after 9/11, the greatest terrorist attack on United States soil. So, from that perspective, I'm not sure that the fears are warranted there, though I don't know that it's a negative thing to say we're going to do a good job of vetting the refugees that come in and of making sure that we're doing everything possible to protect the homeland, but also recognizing that, our greatest threat is not somebody coming in as a refugee, but most likely someone crossing from Canada or Mexico into our country, so through illegal immigration. And we've got 11 million of them now. So I mean, if that's the way that somebody's going to come, then we definitely have routes and avenues for them to head this way. So.
We're slightly better off than the rest of Europe in that we have a moat to stop them. But Southern Europe, the flood of refugees is really impossible to stop. I must admit, I'd probably prefer the North Africa to Italy crossing to the vagaries of Turkey, Greek islands, and then slogging it up through the Balkans were it may. but I suspect the chances of drowning are slightly higher by that route. Yes, I mean, I'm impressed by the figure of 750,000. I sort of grew up thinking of the States with the "give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free" associated with it, which, frankly, I think is the attitude we should be taking as Christians. We are not, on the whole, taking that in Europe, but then to a considerable extent, we're post-Christian here. But certainly, it surprised me that a set of governors who would seem by their rhetoric to want to appear Christian would be wanting to reject the refugee. I don't know. Maybe there's no bringing together of the rhetoric with the actuality there.
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting is, with most of these governors, they are they're in states that would primarily be labeled as the Bible Belt in the southern part. So so they have to wave the Christian flag in that sense, but they also have to wave the American flag in terms of being a patriot. And so I think that their struggle is, how do we wave both the American and the Christian flag at the same time? And so I think the convenient thing is, when you're talking about an issue like this, wave the American flag. Let's keep them out. We don't want them here. When they need a vote, then we wave the Christian flag and are able to do that. So certainly politicking at its best in that sense. But no, I do think the question, and one of the things I had mentioned to you, even among believers here, there's a split even there about how the United States should handle the issue of refugees coming in, and should we welcome them with open arms? Should we refuse them at the borders? And there are Christians who land on either side, which I think is not right either way in those two extremes. Certainly the extreme that says that we just fling open the doors and let everybody in without any process or anything like that would not be helpful. Nobody does that at their home, and so it wouldn't make sense to do that as a nation either. But also the idea of, we're just going to shut everything down, we're not going to help those who would come, is problematic as well. And so I think you've got to find a middle road there, especially for believers. And that was one of the questions I was going to ask you, to see what you thought. In the sense that Jesus gave the responsibility to care for the widows and the orphan and the poor to his disciples. How do you look at that from a perspective of a civil government? Does a civil government bear that same responsibility? Is it just the responsibility of believers? And if it is just the responsibility of believers, is this not a discussion that needs to be had within the church, and in support of offering assistance to the government in that sense, of being willing to do what's necessary to settle those who would come in? So I was curious what you thought about that.
We are in slightly different situations, in that you're in a country where, if I remember my statistics, round about 50% of people still attend church regularly.
That's about right.
and I'm in a country where something around about 5% of people attend church regularly. That 5% here couldn't meet the need, couldn't remotely meet the need. Your 50% possibly could. Now, I'm very pleased to say that that my main church has indicated a distinct willingness to welcome refugees, and in fact, a group of people have recently got back from a trip to the Greek islands to hand out supplies to refugees landing there. I'm willing to bet that if our government would actually let them into the country, we could immediately find lodging for 100 or so, at least. And as the government are basically saying 20,000 within the next 5 years, I'm not exactly overwhelmed by the generosity, but at least it's not none, which some places are saying.
Right.
Yes, although it's only a very small percentage on that particular front, we could cope with it. From a technical point of view, though, Jesus was talking against a background of a country which was at least broadly following Jewish law, and Jewish law already provided for the care of widows and orphans and the poor to at least an extent. I mean, Jesus criticized the Pharisees for neglecting that duty, but at least it was understood as a duty. It's difficult when considering Judaism because it isn't just a religion, it's also a nationality in a way, an ethnicity at least. It's complicated by them not actually having a physical nation for so many years. But clearly that was a nation living under a divine rule of sorts. Here, of course, we are looking at a state which is nominally Christian. Even though only 5% of us go to church, the Church of England is an established church. The Church of England has a say, a very small say, actually in government, because there's a set of bishops that sit in our upper chamber of Parliament at the moment. I think on that basis, it is reasonable for me to consider that if I can persuade them by voting and other political means that it is the responsibility of the nation as a whole, looking at it a little like Israel was, to fulfill the same kind of functions as Israel filled or should have filled in Jesus's day, and preferably a little more generously than that, then that's entirely reasonable. Unfortunately, of course, I have to go through the democratic process to get there, which doesn't always work. I could criticize our current government a lot for that. I used actually to think that although we weren't observant Christian, a sort of Christian social gospel-y ethos had seeped into our bones. Unfortunately, then we had the Thatcher government, and the whole country took an abrupt step to the right politically, and one of Mrs. Thatcher's celebrated quotes was, "There is no such thing as society," which is exactly the opposite of what I want to encourage. So I think it is legitimate to hope, at least, that the state will do it. But if the state doesn't do it, then it's the responsibility of churches to make up the difference. And at the moment, our government are not really providing adequately for the poor, and several of the churches, including both the ones I normally attend, are operating food banks and giving in that way. So we do our bit, our best, at least.
Yeah, yeah. No, there's definitely, when you have to deal with some of the bureaucratic red tape that has to be cut, it makes it even more difficult to be able to do things like that. So, in that sense, let me ask you, Chris, on this. Do you think that that those who, and let's just take Syria for instance, are fleeing from Syria, fleeing from the violence, whether that is from the Islamic State or that's through the Syrian government, which we know is over the past number of years has been not treating their people very well anyway. And I think this is probably the mindset that many in, at least in my country, think. If we could create a peaceful Syria, then the people wouldn't want to leave, right?
Yes, indeed so.
Yeah.
I mean, both of those I'd have said, and there's a potential third reason as well, in that it's underreported. But in recent years, there's been a famine in Syria, which has meant that there have been food shortages.
Mm-hmm.
And some people have suggested that the bit of the Arab Spring that affected Syria probably wouldn't have happened without there being food shortages behind it. Yeah, all of those. I'm not particularly certain that the reason why they feel obliged to leave Syria is going to be at the top of my mind when offering them refuge here. Though, of course, the fact that Syria is a very violent country at the moment, for whatever reason, does weigh on me. If they're not physically safe, I think they are a higher priority for me than if they were merely hungry. And I'm not entirely sure whether I'm taking a correct Christian perspective there. I suspect you could argue in exactly the opposite direction on that.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
But yes, I think that's going to take us on to a really major additional point. But I do notice we've got to the halfway point, and I do like to pause at that point to allow a slightly longer introduction, at least of guests. So I'm Chris Eyre. I'm one of the Energian editors, and I blog at airlines.energian.net. Michael, would you like to introduce yourself and your books, if you can plug any?
Yeah, absolutely. Michael Kennedy, pastor in Georgia in the United States, wrote a book through Energion called Parent Driven Discipleship, which is available certainly through Energion and also through Amazon. And I blog pretty regularly at michaelfkennedykjr.wordpress.com.
Excellent. Okay, the causes of all this is something which there's a huge issue about. I mean, I do know, for instance, taking the case of Syria, that I tend to the left. At least I certainly do in US terms. And the liberal press were extremely happy when the Arab Spring arrived and various near dictators or dictators started getting toppled or at least threatened, Assad being one of them.
Right.
Gaddafi in Libya, Mubarak in Egypt. The trouble is, we offered some support for rebels in Libya, and we now have a failed country there, which is one of the reasons why we are having trouble with refugees coming from Africa into Europe at the moment. Egypt seems to have gently popped itself back to something quite close to a military dictatorship after some unrest. And our support for opponents of Assad seems to have turned against us so completely. It's ridiculous. Earlier on, of course, both our countries were prominent in removing the leadership of Iraq, which is where the other main center of Islamic states is, although it apparently started in Syria and expanded eastwards. Are we actually to blame for this? Is a question I have to ask myself.
Yeah. No, and I think it's a legitimate question to consider. And I would back up and ask the question in this sense. For instance, in Iraq, are the Iraqi people better off today than they were under Saddam Hussein's reign? And you know, we could guess at that. I'd like to know what they actually thought in that sense. You know, if and the same thing in Syria as well. Are they better off? Could they be better off than they are currently if the regime that's in place was removed? Now, though, you're looking at the Assad regime, and now you're looking at the IS as well that's there. So, you know, if you, I would say it this way: the only option, if you're going to do anything at all that's on the table without putting boots on the ground, is to attempt drone strikes and air assault on locations of value in those countries. But again, as soon as you do that, you create shortages of some sort. And those shortages will be filled. Oftentimes, you know, it's interesting, the countries that the United States has helped in the past, whether they were removing a dictator and setting up what they considered a democratic government in those locations, they always had to funnel money there, supplies, military aid, all of those things. And what ends up happening usually is that those who are in power profit, and the people never see any of those benefits. And so I would look and say that I probably would assume has created some of the concern, some of the frustration. You know, should it lead to violent extremism? No, but I do think in some sense that we have created problems. I don't think with bad motives. I think the motives oftentimes were good motives to try and stabilize a country, to try to help a country, to try to help the people, to try to bring humanitarian aid along with basic human rights that they weren't experiencing previously. But again, a Western democratic mindset dropped in by parachute in a Middle Eastern country usually is not going to turn out very well. And so I think in a large sense, we, and I'm speaking as a United States citizen here, we need to look at some Middle Eastern countries that have gotten it right and bring them in on the process, instead of just using them for takeoff zones for our military. You know, for instance, if you take Turkey, actually had family that lived over there for about 3 years, and certainly there are concerns that are there, but there's concerns here in the United States. I mean, we had people that are killing people every day here as well. So. But you look at a country like Turkey and ask the question, how can you leverage what's happened there, and put that on display for some of these other countries to see, and in an essence help them do that and get out of the way.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's some of my thoughts on that, Chris. What's your thoughts?
I find Turkey very, very interesting, actually, because Turkey is the one Islamic country which has been sitting in the waiting room as a possible additional member of the European Union. There have been lots of issues revolving around that. Not least the fact that Greece would attempt to veto that on every possible occasion, because there's still a dispute over Cyprus, there's disputes over various Greek islands, and the Greeks, frankly, haven't forgiven Turkey as a nation for the expulsion of all the Greek-speaking Christians by Kemal Ataturk at the founding of the state.
Right.
But it is democratic, granted. Their democracy has returned an Islamist, to some extent, government, but that hasn't gone so far as ending the democratic process in Turkey. I think they think that would be going too far. There have also been huge concerns about human rights in Turkey for a very long time, and one of the biggest issues is their treatment of the Kurds, which has been lamentable. Absolutely lamentable. And mind you, one of the main causes of terrorism in Turkey has been the PKK, the Kurd Nationalist Party. Right. So there are no particular white knights in that story. Both sides have a lot to answer for. But yes, that is possibly an example. More recently, Tunisia actually appears to have managed to come out the other side of the Arab Spring with a reasonable democratically elected government that isn't too far in any particular direction and which still has control of the country. So I'd like to have a much closer look at how Tunisia has done it and is doing it, to see if that could be a model and they could export that. There is a slight lack of democracy elsewhere in the Arab world. I suppose you can go outside the Arab world to other Muslim countries which are democracies. I mean, Pakistan is a very large Muslim democracy. So is Indonesia. Indonesia's democracy is a bit dubious at times, but then so is Pakistan's. But they are both potential examples there. And if it's merely a question of the religious background rather than something to do with the Arab temperament, historically, I mean, it's going to be an inherited tendency. Maybe there's some hope there, but certainly I agree with you. Imposing our forms of democracy really doesn't seem to have worked. That was tried in Algeria some considerable while ago, and that ended up with an Islamist takeover before Islamist was a word, and an immediate counter-revolution by the army there, which has basically been pretty much the situation ever since. It's an uneasy truce. What we have supported traditionally in the area are non-democratic strongmen. I mean, the time was when we supported Mubarak. Time was when we supported Saddam Hussein, when we thought Iran was a greater threat.
Yeah.
The Saudi monarchy are no great example of democracy, and they're a firm ally. I do wonder if some form of monarchy might not just possibly be more to the of the local taste than is democracy. There are some advantages in having a single person in control of a state over a democratic way, and I can't rule out the possibility that for some people that would outweigh the benefits of a democracy. It doesn't for me. Perhaps it might for them. But moving on from that, there's something that has occurred to me, and that's this: that Islamic State, unlike Al Qaeda, have declared themselves a caliphate. So, for the first time, we've got one of these radical Islamic groups, Islamic terrorist groups, which actually occupies land. That puts them in a different category from, for instance, Al Qaeda, who may be centered anywhere. I mean, the current center of Al Qaeda may be in the house next door to me, for all I know. In point of fact, centre of Al Qaeda was in fact in London for a little while at one point. We do know that after the event. But as an organisation which holds land, and it has to hold land in order to declare the caliphate, it seems to me that makes it vulnerable to exactly what you were, I think, trying to avoid suggesting, which is boots on the ground.
Yeah.
I can't see us being able to rely on our local partners there, with the possible exception of the Kurds, who aren't strong enough to do the job by themselves. Certainly the Iraqis have not conducted themselves well. We don't get on with Assad. The Turks are too busy fighting the Kurds on another front to be any major use. I think we are going to have to think about boots on the ground, and where it isn't an insurgency that could be hidden in every house, absolutely. But something that actually wants to hold land, perhaps that gives us a chance of, if we do have responsibility for this, can we actually finally fix it, which we don't seem to have been able to with Al Qaeda and other dispersed terrorist organizations. Should we do that now?
Well, it appears that we have gone in where human rights violations are great, and the potential for terrorists to come and attack us is great, and tried to stop it there, versus staying at home and sealing the borders or whatever, that would be done from that point of view. What we did in Iraq was attempt to do what I think would have to be done with the IS as well. And we see how well that went in Iraq. And again, it could be that, the arguments have been made that we would have, had we essentially gone full force from the beginning and done what had to be done, that we could have accomplished what we needed to accomplish and then pulled out at that point. But it was almost kind of a half-hearted effort through the process, which ended up creating opportunity for groups to build up resistance and begin to do that. So I'll be honest, I'm hesitant to say let's put boots on the ground, because the track record is not that good for us. I mean, so that's where I would. But then again, I asked the question as well: do you just back out completely and let it shake out however it's going to shake out, and not worry about it at that point? I don't know if that's the right answer in that either. When you look back at Iraq, one of the things that's interesting about that situation is that there was a lot of global support initially going in. Multiple countries saying, yes, we need to do this. This will be what's best for the world.
Yeah.
And then the intelligence that we perceived on the front end that gave us the green light to go turned out to not be as good as we thought it was when we got there. And then people started backing out at that point, saying, well, there's no reason. Well, at that point, the United States, along with the UK, were in the midst of it, saying, well, we're here now, we got to do something. And so I think if the only way I would be comfortable would be to go in with a large enough coalition, including countries surrounding that location immediately. One fell swoop to go in, to do it, to pull out, and then at that point, let the chips fall where they may. But again, I still think if you do that, you create the opportunity once again. If there's a power vacuum, somebody's looking to fill the power vacuum. And if you remove, let's say, the Islamic State out, what's to say that Al Qaeda in Iraq and Afghanistan is not going to rise up and go in as soon as whoever pulls out and try to reestablish power and gain authority and land at that point. So I don't know that there's a good answer, to be honest with you, on that.
I'm not traditionally terribly keen on any kind of military endeavor myself. As the years pass and I read the Gospels more, I seem to be getting increasingly pacifist in my views, to be honest. I go for the love your enemies, hard though that might be, particularly in the case of, say, ISIS, and turn the other cheek, walk the extra mile, etc., and the non-violence. But in this particular case, I think I can reasonably make an exception, and there are a set of reasons for that. One of those stems from the nature of Islamic State, in terms of its own stated objectives, because as far as it's concerned, the Caliph cannot make peace with people on a permanent basis. And if you cannot make peace on a permanent basis, and that includes repeat periods of temporary peace, you cannot live with them unless they're non-aggressive. But also the Caliph is obliged to wage war all
Right.
the time in some direction. Now, that is an entity which you cannot live with, particularly when it uses techniques like Islamic State has been using. I don't like war. I particularly am not keen on this business of bombing people out of existence at no cost of life or limb to yourself. I watched a couple of days ago a video clip from the cockpit of one of the French planes, and it looks like a video game, except it's real people getting killed at the other end of it, and that made me feel somewhat nauseous. I think that cheapens our attitude to the lives we are taking.
Yeah.
And I think it enables us to contemplate just carrying on and on and on bombing where it doesn't bring us a final solution to the problem. Now, I'm broadly a pacifist, but if I have to be in a war, and I think we are perforce in a war, I think we have some responsibility for the mess in the first place. And if we have some responsibility for the mess, we have a responsibility to clear it up. As such, I think we need to end it as quickly and effectively as is possible. And I think that is going to involve boots on the ground. I wouldn't if it was just an insurgency that hit among people. But it's an organization which, in order to exist on its current terms, has to hold ground. And it has in the back of its mind that there shall be a final apocalyptic battle at a particular location in Syria. So to my mind, all we have to do is turn up at that location in Syria in absolutely overwhelming force and wait for them. And as they turn up, hopefully destroy them. And as an exception to my general principle, that is basically where I think we have to go here. Have you any closing thoughts? I noticed that we have about 1 minute.
No, I agree with you on that. I think that I think it will eventually get to the point where we have to put boots on the ground to clean up the situation. I do hope that we've learned from our mistakes and we'll be able to deal with it differently this go around, if it comes to that, and then we can hopefully reap the benefit of a Syria that's without violence and without the issues that it's facing currently. So
I can certainly pray for that.
absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, that's enough this week. There will not be a Global Christian Perspectives next Friday, as it's the Thanksgiving weekend, but we will be resuming the Friday after that.
All right. Enjoyed it, Chris. Thank you.